Alright guys, so at this point in the lesson, you should have completed several different watercolor techniques for use in this assignment. So your background should be finished. We used some wet on wet along with a tissue lift in the top of this. We used a bubble wrap technique, salt, and plastic wrap. And now what we're going to be doing is laying out our mountainous landscape, okay? So it's going to be a little bit abstract. It's obviously not meant to look realistic, but I think that what you'll see is that you can create a really beautiful piece using color, focusing on color and texture here in this assignment. Okay, so what I want you to be thinking about as you're working on this are the shapes of mountains, and I will probably provide you with some resource images in your Google Classroom or on Flipgrid for you to look at. So I'm going to consider the following before I start drawing. First of all, you want to have a pencil and eraser, and then I want you to pick your first piece of paper or your first color that you're going to work with. Now what you have to remember is that this mountain is only going to go up this far. It's not going to go farther than that. I guess it could go a little bit farther because we'll be layering things, but you still want to see some of this sky. So be thinking about your first set of mountains. And what I'm going to do is move these papers aside, and I am going to simply start lightly sketching with my pencil the shapes of the mountains, okay? So you can pause this, slow it down. I'll try and give you a good close-up once I'm finished with it and ready to show it to you. So I am going to start pretty high at the top of my paper. And I'm not worried about drawing a perfect mountain because these are essentially going to be guidelines. So let's see if we can move in a little bit closer to this. So I'm going to pause this and see if I can give you a better shot. Okay, so here's a close-up shot of the line I drew out for the first set of mountains that I'm going to include in the picture. Now, I made this a lot darker than I normally would so that you could see it better on the screen. I didn't want to go back over it with Sharpie because I'm eventually going to be tearing this, which you will see. And I wanted to be able to erase any pencil line that might show in the tears. Okay, so I'm going to pause it, we're going to zoom back out, and I'm going to show you how to tear this. Okay, so zoom back out and I have this sketched out, and what I want you to understand is that this is a guideline. You're not going to tear perfectly on this edge, so don't worry about that. If you drew something and then you can't tear exactly on that line, that is fine. I probably won't be able to get things to tear on that line perfectly either. So one thing I do want you to do when you're tearing is you need to pay attention to which way to tear the paper to create a white edge. So this was just like a practice one that I was working on, and notice that each of these mountains has a white edge on it. So that's formed by the tearing of the paper. So one thing you can do, one thing I typically do is I take my paper and I start tearing just a little bit, and I'm gonna tear forward, okay, not back. If I tear back, I'm not gonna get the white edge. So I wanna tear forward, and I'm just gonna follow along that pencil line that I sketched to the best of my ability. And I'm actually gonna try and keep this in 2 solid pieces in case I want to use both of the pieces in my artwork. Okay, so now I have my first set of torn mountains, and I am going to keep this because if you look at the shape of it, it also looks like a mountain. So maybe I'll use it later in my composition. So I'm going to set this aside, and right now I'm just going to kind of lay this on top of here and get a feel for where I might place it, how high I want it to be, and then I'm going to do my next set of mountains. Okay, so here we have the first set, and I'm going to be working with my lighter blue with the bubble wrap print on it first, and then I'm going to be working with my paper that has salt. So the next thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna grab that paper, make sure all the salt has been cleaned off of it, and I'm gonna sketch out the next line for my mountains. Okay, so now I have my darker blue paper with the salt wiped off. You can still see there might be a little bit of salt stuck here and there. That's not anything you need to worry about. So when I sketch out the next one, I'm gonna follow the same process. I'm gonna use a pencil and sketch out the line for my mountains. And then I'm gonna tear them the same way I did before. One thing I want you to think about as you're doing this is you don't actually want the mountains to have the same exact contour line, right? So I don't want to just put this here, trace it on here, and tear it again, because we want to create something a little bit more interesting. So as you're thinking about it, and you're thinking about the fact that these are going to be layered, you want to think about creating different heights and different low points and different shapes within each mountain to create something interesting. So I'm going to go ahead and sketch this out, and then I'll give you a close-up of what it looks like. Okay, so here's the close-up of the line I sketched out for this. And of course, you don't need to use the exact same contour line that I'm using. You can come up with your own. I'm just showing this to you because I know some of you will want to see it. So in my next step, of course, I'm going to tear. So I'm going to zoom back out and show you what that looks like. Okay, so I've zoomed back out, and now I'm going to follow the same process. I am putting this between my fingers, and I am tearing forward and following along my pencil line to some extent. As you know, it's not going to be exactly where those lines were. They're just a guide. And then I'm also going to attempt to, just like I did in the last one, keep two solid pieces intact instead of tearing it into pieces, so that I have them if I want to use them or if I need to use them for some reason. Okay, so there's the second set. And again, I have two pieces, two solid pieces, so if I wanted to use this at some point, I could. So now I have this and I have this, right? And what I will need to start thinking about as I'm working is just, do I want to add anything in? Am I happy with the way the contour lines are working together? Do I want to tear deeper into a part to make a part stand out more? Do I need to make any adjustments to it? All right, so now we're going to repeat this process with the purple. So we're going to do the same thing. I'm going to go ahead and draw out a contour line, and then I'll zoom in and show it to you. So here's my purple paper that I did with the plastic wrap, and now I'm going to start sketching. And again, I'll show it to you as soon as it's done. Okay, hopefully you can see that clearly. I know it's a little bit hard, but again, I did not want to use Sharpie in case it were to show in the final piece. Pencil's always a safe bet because you can erase it. So again, we're going to follow that same exact process. We're going to tear it, move with the tear moving forward, and then we'll layer them together. Okay, so I'm going to stop here and I'm going to show you something. I started tearing the wrong way. Notice that the white is not on the front. Okay, not a big deal. You just come back in and make sure you fix that by pulling forward as you're working. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at the three pieces together and begin to think about whether we want to make adjustments or additions to this. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to put this on top of our background paper. I'm going to zoom out a little bit for that. Okay, so I have my background paper here laid out, and all I've done is start layering my pieces of my mountains on. So this was the first piece I did, and I just laid it on top of here. And then my second piece and my final piece, which will line up with the bottom of the landscape. So this one's going to go at the bottom. Okay, so now what I have to think about is, am I happy with the way it looks? Do I want to move this higher? Do I want to move it lower? Do I want to shift it over a little bit? You'll notice that these papers are wider than this one, and that gives you a little bit of leeway to move certain pieces over and adjust things. So I could potentially think about this being at the edge of the paper, and then bringing this one a little bit further down here, and then moving this one up so that it looks like this. So you're going to want to play around with the arrangement before you make a final decision. And one thing that might help you to see it more clearly is taking some pieces of paper and laying those on the edges so that you're getting a view of it as what it would look like once we trim the edges off. Okay, so you're going to go ahead and decide, how do I want this to be layered? And then once you make that final decision, we'll talk about how to glue everything down. All right, so go ahead and lay it out. And I'm going to do the same thing, and we'll come back once I've made some decisions and I'll show you the next step. Okay, so I think I have finally gotten everything laid out in a position that I like. So I'm going to show you what I was referring to with the pieces of paper. So I just have some white paper, and I'm just going to lay it on the edges like this. And the reason I'm doing this is it helps me to have a better understanding of what the final piece will look like once everything gets trimmed down. I'm pretty happy with that. So I think I am going to go ahead and mark out where each piece belongs. The other thing that we're going to be doing is we're going to be adding our sun or moon, whatever you want it to be, because as you know, this is not intended to be realistic. This is focusing on texture and color and creating something that's just a beautiful abstract landscape. I hope you think it's beautiful. I love the colors in it. So especially this time of year when it's kind of cold and dreary. So I'm going to go ahead and add that in at some point, but now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take these papers off. I'm just going to double check and make sure I'm happy with everything. So I'm going to scoot that like that, move this up a little bit, and I think that's pretty good. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to hold this in place, and very lightly I'm going to trace where this mountain is going to go. That's just going to help me once I put the glue on to get it back in the right place. You need to put a little loop of drafting tape underneath it to hold it in place. That might be a good idea. But for now, this is what I'm just going to hold it in place and trace around it. And then I'm going to come down here now, and I'm going to trace where this one is going to be on top of the light blue one. And then I'm going to do the same thing with my purple mountains. I'm going to trace around the top edge of those. Okay. And then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take a ruler or a scrap paper, depending on whether you're at home or at school, and I'm just going to kind of make a mark to show where that edge is. I'm going to do the same thing over here, and everything's in pencil so that if I mess up or I make a mistake or I need to adjust something, I can go back and my painting is not ruined. Okay, so I think I've got everything fairly well set up, so I can now take the pieces off. Before I pull anything off too much, I'm going to double check. Let's see if I can zoom in and show you kind of where these lines were as I pull pieces off. Okay, so if you look closely, you can see the outline of the mountain here that I traced. And I can now pull this one off. And again, you would have to look closely, but you can see the pencil line showing me where I'm going to glue my next piece back on. And then of course we can see it here in our background, okay? All right, so let's talk about gluing. This paper is thick, And glue sticks have a tendency to dry out and not work very well, so we are going to be using a tacky glue, which we have at school. If you don't have tacky glue at school or at home, you can definitely use a glue stick or Elmer's white glue, whatever you prefer, but for this I'm just going to be using a tacky glue, so they're just a little bit stronger. Okay, so I've got my glue ready, and there's one last thing to do before I glue this down, and that is that I need to decide where I'm going to be placing my silver sun or moon, what have you. So make sure you do know the placement of where you want that to be before you glue everything in place and realize you forgot to do that. So that's really up to you where you want to put it. So my pencil lines are helping me put things back together, just like a little puzzle, before I go further. So you could put it up high in the sky if you wanted. You could put it smack dab in the middle, which I'm not a big fan of, but you could do. You can move it off to a side, which would be preferable in my opinion. But I'm going to tuck mine behind the mountains just a little bit, so it's just peeking out from there. And I'm again going to move it off center. I don't want it directly in the middle of my composition. So I'm going to just decide exactly how far I want it underneath there. And again, you can put those papers on if you want, or you can just kind of go like this and get a feel for it and figure out where do you want that to pop out. And then once you've made that decision, you're going to trace around that with your pencil as well, because it's going to be the first piece that gets glued on. So I'm thinking it's probably going to be about there, maybe a touch higher, maybe a little bit more like that. Anyway, play around with it till you get it where you want it, and then like I said, you're going to trace around it. So once I figure out where I'm going to put it, I'll be back. Okay, so I finally figured out where I was putting my moon, and you can see that I traced around it with pencil. If you can't see it on the screen, trust me, it's there. I traced with my pencil so I know where to put it. So now I'm going to be using a tacky glue because this is very thick watercolor paper. And I'm just going to glue the entire piece back together like I'm putting a puzzle together. Okay, anytime you're putting glue on, make sure that you are putting glue on the torn or smaller pieces. So anytime you're applying glue, I suggest you apply it to the piece that's cut or torn out as opposed to the background, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and stick this on there. Don't overdo it with the glue. And I'm just going to hold this in place for a minute or two. That might be a bit of an exaggeration, maybe for 30 seconds to 60 seconds. And then once I feel like it's sticking, I'll move on and do the next piece. So after about 60 seconds, it seems to be pretty solidly in place. So I'm going to take my next piece and I am going to line it up to see where do I want to put that glue. I'm going to flip it over and I'm going to put the glue along the contour edge of the mountain. And focus on this middle section. And then I'm going to just use the bottle to spread that out. At school we do have some popsicle sticks, so if you're in person, I might give you a popsicle stick to spread that out a little bit more. You have an area where you need a little bit more, go ahead and add that. Okay, so I'm going to do this for each piece, and then I'll show you what it looks like once I've glued everything together. But I'll show you this piece before turning video off and finishing it and then bringing it back to show you. Okay, so I'm going to turn this over, and I'm using those guidelines I drew earlier to line this back up. And and then I'm going to hold it in place for 60 seconds. And I'm going to do the same thing with the remaining 2 pieces, and then I'll show you what it looks like once it's finished. Okay, so everything has been glued into place, and now I'm ready for the very last step. So I'm going to turn over my artwork, and you can see the various layers, and I'm just going to go along with the pencil, mark those edges, grab a pair of scissors, and I'm just going to very neatly cut those off. And then that's it. So I'll show you what this looks like as soon as it's done. And there you have it, just a really simple abstract painting, kind of a mountain landscape inspired painting using watercolors and a variety of different texture. So I hope you had fun with it, and I hope you like your finished composition.